Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into anti-trafficking efforts. We're going to be looking specifically at how federal funding impacts services for survivors.
Okay.
Our main source for this deep dive is an academic article titled Compounding Institutional Exclusion and Harm, a case study of federally funded Alaskan anti-trafficking service providers. So we're going to break down this system, this complex system. We're going to be exploring the goals, the stated goals, and then the realities that survivors actually face.
Right. A system that, despite its good intentions, sometimes ends up creating these unintended consequences that actually end up harming survivors.
Yeah, it seems like we see that a lot in these big systems. So
Yeah.
before we jump into the specifics of this article, can you give us a quick overview of the different approaches to combating human trafficking?
Yeah. So there are three main approaches. You have the criminal justice approach, which focuses on prosecuting traffickers. Then you have the human rights approach, which prioritizes providing support and services for survivors. And then finally, you have neo-abolitionism, which seeks to eradicate the entire sex industry.
And the U.S. mainly uses which one?
The U.S. leans heavily towards neo-abolitionism.
Okay.
This approach has garnered a lot of criticism.
What are some of the criticisms?
Some argue that neo-abolitionism overemphasizes law enforcement and can negatively impact marginalized communities, especially sex workers.
Makes sense.
This focus can also, it can reinforce the idea of the quote-unquote ideal victim, which can lead to biases in who receives help.
Okay, yeah, so where does Alaska fit into all of this?
Right. So this article uses Alaska as a case study and examines how the state's high per capita funding for anti-trafficking efforts contrasts with the reality of services that are available to survivors.
So high funding, but potentially lacking services.
Exactly.
Already an interesting contradiction.
And to illustrate this, the article highlights the story of Ahila Banks,
Okay.
a sex trafficking survivor in Alaska.
Yeah, her story's pretty powerful. Can you tell us a little more about Ahila and her experiences?
So Ahila was trafficked as a minor in Alaska.
Yeah.
And when she tried to seek help from a detective, he ended up exploiting her, offering her protection in exchange for sexual favors.
Oh my gosh. It's horrifying that someone in a position of power would take advantage of her vulnerability like that.
It is. And tragically, that's not even the worst of it. Later, Ahila was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit sex trafficking,
Oh, wow.
even though she was the victim.
Right.
This conviction put her on the sex offender registry, which made her even more vulnerable and hindered her access to any kind of support.
It's unbelievable. It's like the system that's meant to protect her ended up trapping her further.
It's a tragic example of how the system can fail those who need it the most. And this is where that discrepancy between funding and services becomes even more apparent.
Yeah. You mentioned that Alaska receives a surprisingly high amount of funding. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. Alaska actually gets a significant amount of federal funding per capita for anti-trafficking programs. However, the number of officially reported sex trafficking cases in Alaska is relatively low.
So is trafficking actually less prevalent in Alaska, or is there something else going on?
That's a key question the article raises.
Okay.
The low number of reported cases might not accurately reflect the true scope of the problem.
Right.
NGOs often use broader definitions of sex trafficking than law enforcement. So a lot of instances of exploitation might not meet the strict legal definition of criminal sex trafficking, leading to significant underreporting.
Okay, so there could be a lot more trafficking happening than the official numbers suggest.
Yeah.
And Alaska also has state and city anti-trafficking task forces, right?
You do.
Okay.
And the article points out that these task forces might influence service providers' relationships with law enforcement. The emphasis on collaboration with law enforcement could lead organizations to prioritize those relationships over the needs of survivors. And this is especially concerning for survivors who, like Ahila, have had negative experiences with the police.
Yeah. Let's go back to Ahila's story for a moment.
Okay.
She reached out to multiple Alaskan organizations that receive funding, for anti-trafficking work, but her experiences were incredibly disheartening.
Yes.
Can you walk us through those?
Certainly. One organization, the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation, initially approved her for a housing voucher.
Okay.
But after the detective intervened, she was deemed ineligible because of her presence on the sex offender registry.
It's ironic and deeply unfair that a system designed to help her ended up using her past victimization against her.
Yeah.
What about the other organizations that she contacted?
She reached out to Covent House, who did provide her with housing,
Okay.
but they weren't equipped to address her safety concerns or her legal needs.
And what about the Alaska Institute for Justice?
They initially seemed promising, but unfortunately, the help that they discussed never materialized.
It's disheartening to hear about these repeated failures.
Yeah.
Did she try contacting any other organizations?
She did. She contacted the Alaska Native Justice Center, but was initially told that their services were only for Native individuals.
Oh, wow.
Later, she learned that this wasn't accurate, but it highlights the potential for misinformation within these systems.
Yeah, it's almost as if navigating these systems adds another layer of difficulty for survivors who are already dealing with so much.
Exactly, and it gets even more complicated when we consider the funding structures and reporting requirements that are placed on these organizations. The article argues that the current system incentivizes a focus on institutional processes over the actual needs of survivors.
Can you explain what you mean by that? How does the funding structure create this problem?
Well, for one, there's a heavy reliance on self-reported data from organizations receiving funding. And this can be problematic, as organizations might be incentivized to present a more positive picture of their work, in order to secure continued funding.
So the numbers might not tell the whole story.
Right.
What are some other issues with the way that the system is currently set up?
Another problem is the limitations of referral mechanisms.
Okay.
If the services being referred to are inaccessible or inadequate, the referral itself doesn't solve the problem.
Right.
The article also points out the risks of prioritizing relationships with law enforcement, especially for survivors who have had negative experiences with the police.
Yeah, and we can't forget the issue of exclusionary criteria used by some service providers.
Absolutely. Organizations often have specific requirements for who qualifies for their services, and these criteria can be based on factors like substance use, criminal history, or even moral judgments.
Oh, wow.
This can end up excluding the most vulnerable individuals who may need the most help.
It seems like there's a disconnect between the intention of providing support and the reality of how these systems operate. It's frustrating to see these well-intentioned efforts falling short.
It is. And it's why the article calls for a critical examination of the current system and a shift in focus to prioritize the needs and experiences of survivors.
So if the current system has all these issues, what are some alternative approaches to anti-trafficking efforts?
The article highlights the role and potential benefits of community-driven mutual aid and peer support programs, especially those led by sex workers.
That's interesting. Why are those programs seen as a potential solution?
These programs often operate outside of the traditional system,
Okay.
and they provide a different kind of support. They offer a space where survivors can feel safe and understood without judgment or fear of reprisal.
Yeah.
Plus, they don't rely on federal funding, so that gives them more flexibility and autonomy.
It sounds like they're filling a critical gap in services. We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive, exploring the complexities of anti-trafficking efforts and the shortcomings of the current system.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, I want to go back to Ahela's story for a moment.
Okay.
What happened to her after she reached out to all of these organizations? Did she ever find the support that she needed?
Unfortunately, Ahela's story doesn't have like a neat resolution.
Right.
The article doesn't really provide any details about her life after these encounters with service providers.
Okay.
It kind of leaves us with, this stark image of the barriers that she faced and the ways that the system failed to meet her needs.
Yeah, that's both powerful and unsettling. It really
Yeah.
underscores the need for, some systemic change. But
Yeah.
it's also important to note, as you mentioned earlier, that the article doesn't provide, specific recommendations.
Right.
It's more of a call to examine the current approach and its potential harm to survivors.
Yeah, exactly. It encourages this critical analysis of the system and highlighting how, federal funding structures, while vital, can also create these unintended consequences.
We've touched on some of these consequences, like the overemphasis on law enforcement,
Right.
and then the exclusionary criteria used by some service providers.
Right.
What are some other mechanisms that contribute to these unintended outcomes?
The article points out that this reliance on quantitative metrics, like the number of survivors served, it can create this skewed picture of success.
Yeah.
It can incentivize organizations to prioritize quote unquote easy cases,
Mhm.
those that fit that ideal victim narrative and can show clear progress.
So while an organization might report serving a large number of survivors, the quality and effectiveness of that service might be lacking,
Right.
especially for those with more complex needs.
Precisely. This focus on numbers can also lead to a lack of flexibility and responsiveness to individual needs,
Right.
right? So, organizations might become so focused on meeting these targets that they lose sight of the actual human beings that are supposed to be serving.
It's like trying to fit, square pegs into round holes.
That's a great analogy.
Okay.
And this is where the emphasis on collaboration with law enforcement becomes even more, problematic.
Yeah.
Organizations might feel this pressure to prioritize those relationships over the needs of survivors, especially those who've had negative experiences with law enforcement.
It creates a conflict of interest.
Right.
An organization might be hesitant to advocate for a survivor who is reluctant to cooperate with the police,
Right.
even if that cooperation could be detrimental to the survivor's well-being.
Exactly. And this is why the article stresses the importance of accountability and transparency, and how funding is distributed and used.
Yeah.
We need to ensure that organizations are not only meeting those quantitative targets, but also providing, high quality survivor-centered care.
It seems like a major part of the problem is this power imbalance.
Yeah.
You have these large, well-funded organizations, often staffed by people who haven't experienced trafficking firsthand,
Right.
making decisions that impact the lives of survivors who are often, marginalized and disempowered.
Yeah, that power dynamic is definitely a significant factor.
Yeah.
The article suggests this imbalance can create situations where survivors feel unheard,
Yeah.
disrespected,
Right.
and ultimately re-traumatized by the very system that's meant to help them.
It's a crucial point. If we truly want to help survivors, we need to shift that power dynamic and create systems that center their voices and their experiences.
Absolutely. And this is where alternative approaches to anti-trafficking efforts, like community-driven initiatives, become so important.
We talked briefly about these initiatives earlier. Can you elaborate on why they hold such promise?
These programs, often led by sex workers themselves,
Okay.
they offer a unique perspective
Right. Yeah.
that's frequently missing from traditional service providers. They understand the complexities of the sex industry firsthand and can provide support that's tailored to the specific needs of their community.
So they offer a space where survivors can feel safe, supported, and empowered to make their own choices.
Exactly. They can access resources and support without fear of judgment or reprisal.
Yeah.
And what's striking is that these programs often operate with minimal funding, yet they manage to provide vital support to, countless individuals.
It speaks volumes about the power of community and solidarity.
It does. And the article emphasizes the need to recognize and support these initiatives. Imagine the impact that we could have if these community-driven programs were adequately funded and integrated into the broader, anti-trafficking landscape.
It seems like a potential game changer as
Yeah.
we're discussing these alternative approaches. I think it's important to address the debate surrounding sex work itself.
Right. And it's a complex and often contentious issue.
Yeah.
While the article doesn't explicitly take a stance on legalization, it does highlight how criminalization can increase vulnerability to exploitation.
Because when sex work is pushed underground, it becomes more difficult to regulate.
Right.
And workers are more likely to face violence, abuse, and coercion.
Exactly. Criminalization also makes it harder for sex workers to access help and support.
Right.
They might fear being arrested or judged, which prevents them from reaching out to law enforcement or service providers.
This highlights the importance of distinguishing between sex work and sex trafficking.
Absolutely. Not all sex work is trafficking, and conflating the two only serves to, further stigmatize and marginalize sex workers.
So how do we move forward? How do we create a system that effectively combats trafficking while also respecting the rights and agency of sex workers?
The article suggests shifting our focus from rescue and punishment to prevention and empowerment.
What does that look like in practice?
It means addressing the root causes of trafficking, like poverty, homelessness, and lack of opportunity.
Okay.
It also means providing, sex workers with greater access to resources,
Okay.
education, and healthcare.
It's about creating a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive,
Right.
regardless of their chosen profession.
Exactly. And that requires challenging the stigma and discrimination that sex workers face.
Right.
We need to recognize their humanity, their agency, and their right to work safely and with dignity.
The article makes a compelling argument for including sex workers in the design and implementation of anti-trafficking policies and programs.
Yeah, their lived experience and expertise are invaluable, yet they're often excluded from these conversations.
So how do we change this?
Right.
How do we create a more inclusive and equitable approach to anti-trafficking efforts?
It starts with listening. We need to create spaces where sex workers feel safe to share their experiences, their perspectives, and their solutions.
Yeah.
We need to acknowledge their expertise and involve them in every step of the process,
Okay.
from policy development to program implementation.
And it's not just about listening, it's about amplifying their voices and supporting their leadership in these movements.
Absolutely. We need to challenge those power dynamics that have traditionally silenced and marginalized sex workers.
Right.
We need to recognize and support the incredible work that they're already doing to keep themselves and their communities safe.
The article highlights several organizations led by sex workers that are providing these essential services and advocating for change.
Right.
These groups are often on the front lines, fighting for their rights and the rights of their peers.
And yet they often operate with, minimal funding and support.
Yeah.
Imagine the impact that we could have if we invested in these community-driven initiatives and empowered sex workers to lead the fight against trafficking.
It's a powerful vision,
It is.
and one that I think we should all be striving towards.
It requires this fundamental shift in our thinking. We need to move away from that rescue narrative that often dominates anti-trafficking efforts and embrace a more holistic approach that prioritizes prevention, empowerment, and social justice.
It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to live a life free from exploitation and violence.
A world where sex workers are not seen as victims to be rescued,
Right.
but as individuals with agency, dignity, and rights.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. We've
Yeah.
explored the complexities of anti-trafficking efforts, uncovered some systemic challenges, and discussed the need for a more survivor-centered approach.
Right.
As we wrap up, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? What can they do to contribute to positive change?
I think, it's clear that while federal funding is crucial, for supporting anti-trafficking efforts, the current system can create these unintended consequences that can actually harm survivors.
Right.
And we need to advocate for greater accountability.
Yeah.
More transparency in how that funding is distributed, how it's used, make sure it reaches the people who need it most, and that it supports programs that prioritize, survivor needs and agency.
Yeah, we've also seen how that overemphasis on law enforcement and collaboration with police can actually create risks for survivors, especially those who've had those negative experiences with law enforcement. So we need to create those safe and accessible alternative pathways to support that don't rely on that police involvement.
Absolutely. And those power imbalances that we've talked about, inherent in the current system.
Right.
Those also contribute to these issues. These large organizations often kind of detached from the realities of trafficking, making decisions that impact the lives of survivors who have very little voice or agency in the process.
Right.
And we need to shift those power dynamics. We need to empower survivors, give them a real seat at the table, make sure that their voices and experiences are central to how we shape these policies and these programs.
And we can't forget that incredible work being done by, community-driven initiatives, particularly those led by sex workers themselves.
Absolutely.
These groups are often operating with, very minimal funding and support, but they're providing that vital support and advocacy and really demonstrating the power of community and lived experience.
Right.
We need to invest in these initiatives and amplify those voices and really recognize their expertise and leadership in that fight against trafficking.
Ultimately, creating that lasting change, it really requires us to make a fundamental shift in our thinking.
Yeah.
We have to move away from that rescue narrative. It often dominates anti-trafficking efforts.
Right.
And we need to embrace a more holistic approach, that prioritizes prevention, empowerment, and social justice.
Ahila's story, while it's specific to Alaska, it really highlights those systemic challenges that are present in anti-trafficking efforts across the U.S. And it serves as a reminder that good intentions aren't enough.
Right.
We have to critically examine these systems that we create, make sure they're truly serving those that they are meant to help, and just be willing to adapt and evolve as we learn more.
So, dear listener, as you go about your day, consider, how you can contribute to this much-needed change. Educate yourself about these issues. Engage in conversations.
Mm.
Support organizations that are working to make a difference.
Yeah.
Remember, every action, no matter how small, it contributes to a larger movement for a more just and equitable world.
Well, that's it for our deep dive today. Thank you for joining us. And until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.